We're moving to AI automation, the VP said, laughing as he fired me after 22 years. I calmly signed the exit papers and walked out of the secure facility. By 8:11 a.m., the CFO was reviewing a report. All Pentagon contracts had been frozen. Why isn't Washington responding? Silence. The funny thing about being erased from a company after 22 years is how quickly the building forgets your footsteps. At 7:42 a.m., my badge still opened every reinforced door inside the facility. By 7:43, I was sitting across from a vice president with polished teeth, a silk tie the color of wet asphalt, and a smile so rehearsed it probably had quarterly performance reviews. "Nothing personal," he said, folding his hands. "AI systems are replacing most of your division." Outside the narrow conference window, rain dragged silver lines across the glass like static on an old television. Somewhere deep in the building, servers hummed with the confidence of machines that had never buried a friend, never worked 80-hour weeks, never stayed awake through nights lit only by Pentagon deadlines, and burnt coffee. I signed the papers without arguing. That was the moment he laughed. And that was the moment he made the most expensive mistake in the company's history. The elevator ride down to level 3 lasted exactly 41 seconds. I counted them because I suddenly had nothing else left to count. Not projects, not deadlines, not classified reports stacked in encrypted folders. Not the years I'd spent inside Grayford Dynamics watching nervous 23-year-olds become department directors while I remained the invisible mechanism that kept the machine breathing. 41 seconds. The fluorescent lights above me flickered softly, buzzing like tired insects. Across the mirrored elevator wall, my reflection looked strangely calm for a man who had just been discarded like outdated software. My tie was still straight. My hands were steady. Even my pulse refused to betray me. That unsettled me more than anger would have. The VP's laugh still echoed in my ears. "We appreciate your service, Martin." Service. As if I'd completed a hotel stay instead of sacrificing 22 years inside one of the most secure defense contractors in the country. The door slid open with a hydraulic sigh. 2 security officers waited outside. Protocol. Not because I was dangerous, because the company feared embarrassment more than betrayal. That was always the culture at Grayford. Contain optics first, reality second. "Need an escort, Mr. Vale?" One of them asked carefully. I recognized him. Jensen, former Marine. Good guy. The kind who still said sir even when nobody deserved it. "I know the way out," I replied. For half a second he looked relieved. We walked through the corridor anyway. The hallway stretched long and cold beneath white ceiling panels. Every footstep echoed too sharply. Glass offices lined one side of the passage like illuminated aquariums. Inside them, people pretended not to stare. But they stared. Of course they did. Some looked guilty, some looked curious. A few looked terrified. Those were the smart ones. My division wasn't glamorous. We weren't the public-facing innovation team that appeared in magazines beside glowing headlines about the future of defense intelligence. We were infrastructure continuity, legacy systems integration, fail-safe architecture. In simpler terms, we built the things that kept disasters from becoming headlines. And nobody respected those systems because successful prevention is invisible. That's the curse of reliability. You only notice it when it's gone. A young analyst standing near the break room lowered his eyes as I passed. I remembered helping him fix a catastrophic encryption failure 6 months earlier. He'd nearly lost his clearance over it. Now he looked at me like a ghost walking through the building before realizing he was dead. Funny. People think betrayal feels explosive. It doesn't. It feels administrative. A printed document, a forced smile, a deactivated badge. That's all it takes to erase decades. We reached the final security checkpoint near the lobby. Beyond the reinforced glass doors, the morning storm painted the parking lot in shades of graphite and steel. Employees hurried through the rain carrying coffees and laptops, unaware that somewhere, several floors above them, executives were congratulating themselves for replacing institutional knowledge with predictive algorithms. I stopped beside the scanner pedestal. The security officer shifted awkwardly. "Need me to collect the badge, sir?" I removed it slowly from my jacket pocket. Grayford Dynamics. Level 7 clearance. Martin Vale. The edges were worn smooth after years of use. I stared at it for one quiet second too long. Not because I was sentimental, because I was remembering. 3 cyber attacks neutralized before federal agencies even detected them. A satellite synchronization crisis solved during Christmas dinner while executives toasted champagne at some rooftop gala in D.C. The Riyadh incident. The Nevada blackout. The incident in Norfolk nobody officially acknowledged, 22 years. Reduced to laminated plastic. I handed him the badge. The scanner flashed red immediately. Access revoked. Efficient, heartless, predictable. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Vale," Jensen muttered. I almost smiled. "You too." Then I stepped outside. Cold rain hit my face instantly. The storm carried that metallic city smell. Wet concrete, electricity, exhaust fumes. Thunder rolled somewhere far above the skyline like distant artillery. For the first time in years, I stood beyond the perimeter fence without a destination waiting for me. No alerts, no emergency calls, no encrypted briefings, just silence. My car sat alone near the far end of the lot beneath a flickering security lamp. An aging dark blue sedan surrounded by luxury vehicles owned by people who called PowerPoint presentations operational leadership. I started walking toward it. Halfway there, my phone vibrated. Unknown number. I ignored it. Another vibration came immediately after, then another. I stopped beside a puddle reflecting the gray sky. Something cold settled quietly in my chest. Not fear, pattern recognition. After 2 decades in high-security infrastructure, your instincts become mathematical. You learn the difference between coincidence and sequence. 3 calls in under 10 seconds? That wasn't random. I answered. "Martin," a strained voice said instantly. "Tell me you still have remote access." Elliot Harper, Chief Financial Officer. Interesting. "I thought AI was handling everything now," I replied. Silence. Behind him, I could hear overlapping voices, fast, panicked, office noise stripped of executive composure. Then he exhaled sharply. "Something's wrong." Rainwater slid from my coat sleeve as I opened the car door. "How unfortunate. Don't do this," he snapped. That got my attention. Not the accusation, the fear. Real fear has texture to it. You hear it beneath words like cracks beneath ice. I sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. "What happened?" Another pause. Then quieter. The Pentagon suspended outbound authorizations 15 minutes ago. I looked through the windshield at the massive gray facility looming behind the rain. Interesting. Very interesting. That's impossible, I said calmly. I know. My fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel. No emotion, just calculations. Federal authorization chains didn't freeze accidentally, especially not defense contracts worth billions. Somewhere inside Grayford, executives were probably still assuming this was a temporary communications delay. But I knew better. Because I knew exactly how fragile the architecture really was. And more importantly, I knew which invisible mechanisms they'd just fired. Elliot lowered his voice. Washington isn't responding to us. Thunder rolled again above the city. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, deep inside the secure facility behind me, alarms began flashing red through several upper-floor windows, one floor after another, like dominoes catching fire. And suddenly the storm outside no longer sounded like weather. It sounded like a countdown. They just didn't know it yet. At 8:11 a.m., the executive conference room on level 9 stopped feeling like a fortress. It started feeling like a submarine, with a crack in the hull. Elliot Harper stood near the wall-mounted display, loosening his tie for the third time in 5 minutes, while streams of frozen authorization requests glowed across the screen in stubborn red lines. Pending, unverified, federal hold. The room smelled faintly of espresso and panic. Nobody touched the coffee anymore. The VP who had fired me, Daniel Mercer, paced near the windows overlooking the rain-soaked city. Earlier that morning, he had been smiling like a man unveiling the future. Now his polished confidence looked brittle around the edges, as if someone had tapped a crystal glass too hard. "This is temporary," Mercer said sharply. "Some kind of synchronization delay." Nobody answered him. That silence mattered. Because executives only stop pretending when fear enters the room. A young systems director finally cleared her throat. "We've lost handshake validation with 3 federal nodes." Mercer waved dismissively. "Reboot them." Her expression tightened. "We already did." "Then do it again." Elliot rubbed his forehead slowly. "It's not the nodes." Mercer turned toward him. "Then what is it?" Nobody wanted to say my name first. That was almost flattering. Outside the conference room, the building had begun changing personality. Employees moved faster through the corridors now. Conversations became whispers. Doors opened and closed too quickly. Somewhere downstairs, security teams were already running silent diagnostics. Not because they understood the problem. Because instinctively, everyone in high-security environments recognizes the smell of cascading failure. And cascading failure has a rhythm. First confusion, then denial, then the realization that the people in charge may not actually be in control. Inside my car, parked beyond the perimeter fence, I watched rain strike the windshield in nervous patterns, while Elliot kept talking through the speakerphone. "We're trying to reestablish communication with DC," he said. "Nothing's coming back. You have backups." "They're failing too." Of course they were. I leaned my head lightly against the seat. For 22 years, Grayford executives treated resilience like an annoying expense. They loved innovation presentations, predictive systems, glossy AI demonstrations with dramatic orchestral music playing behind them. But resilience, maintenance, redundancy architecture, that was invisible work. And invisible work is easy to undervalue until the lights begin flickering. You built layers into the federal relay chain, Elliot continued carefully. We know that. Interesting wording. Not the company built, you built, finally. Recognition. Did you document all of it before leaving? He asked. I almost laughed. There it was. The real panic beneath the corporate language. Daniel Mercer had fired a department, but they were only now realizing they had accidentally removed the translator between old infrastructure and new automation. And systems like that don't collapse dramatically at first. They collapse elegantly, quietly, like ice cracking beneath carpet. You replaced my division this morning, I said. Surely the AI can handle it? Elliot didn't answer immediately. In the background, someone raised their voice. Another alarm started sounding somewhere inside the facility. Muted through the phone speaker, but unmistakable. A security alert this time. Not technical, physical. That changed things. My eyes narrowed slightly. What happened now? We lost internal access control on 2 restricted floors. I sat upright instantly. That was bad. Very bad. Grayford's internal security network wasn't supposed to desynchronize from the federal relay backbone. I designed the separation architecture myself after the Norfolk incident 8 years earlier. Unless the adaptive automation layer had attempted to reroute authority permissions dynamically. My stomach tightened. Mercer's voice suddenly exploded through the speaker. Get Vale back in the building. So now I was Mr. Vale again. Interesting how professionalism returns when catastrophe arrives. Elliot lowered his tone. Martin, if there's something we're missing... Rain hammered harder against the windshield. Across the parking lot, emergency lights began reflecting off wet pavement in pulsing crimson streaks. Employees near the entrance were no longer walking calmly. They were clustering, watching phones, speaking too quickly. Panic spreads in offices the same way smoke spreads in ventilation systems, invisible at first, then everywhere at once. I looked at the facility one more time. For years, that building had consumed people whole. Marriages disappeared inside it. Sleep disappeared. Birthdays, funerals. Entire lives traded for classified deadlines and impossible expectations. And the building never loved anyone back. That's the thing about institutions. They mistake dependency for loyalty. My phone buzzed again. Another incoming call, this one from Washington. Interesting. Very interesting. I answered without speaking. Static crackled softly. Then a calm female voice said, Mr. Vale, this is Deputy Director Helen Orsini with Federal Oversight. We need to ask you several questions regarding Grayford Dynamics. Not would like, need. The wording told me everything. In the background behind her, I could hear layered conversations and rapid keyboard activity. Not chaos exactly. Controlled urgency. The dangerous kind. I'm listening, I replied. A brief pause followed. Then she asked the one question that made cold move slowly through my chest. Did Grayford deploy autonomous protocol substitution after terminating your division this morning? I closed my eyes for 1 second. There it was. The executive shortcut. Of course, Mercer had accelerated rollout immediately after firing us. He wanted instant proof the transition worked. Executives always want theater after making brutal decisions. They need visible victory to silence their own doubts. But autonomous substitution inside federal infrastructure without staggered human oversight, that wasn't innovation. That was arrogance wearing expensive shoes. "Tell me exactly what's happening," I said quietly. Orsini exhaled once. At 7:58 a.m., multiple defense authorization chains began recursively invalidating one another. Elliot went silent on the other line. He could hear everything now. Good. At 8:04, she continued, containment protocols attempted self-correction. My fingers tightened around the phone. And? Another pause, then. They interpreted portions of Grayford's network as a hostile authorization environment. Thunder shook the sky above the city. Inside the facility, more emergency lights activated floor by floor. Not random, sequential, like a nervous system shutting down. Mercer's muffled voice echoed somewhere through Elliot's line. "What did Washington say?" Nobody answered him. Probably because nobody wanted to explain that Washington itself had stopped trusting the system. And once federal systems stop trusting you, the machine becomes merciless. Contracts freeze, permissions disappear, communications collapse, doors stop opening, money stops moving, the digital equivalent of watching oxygen leave a room. Orsini spoke again. "Mr. Vale, were there manual stabilizers in place before the automation transition?" I stared at the storm rolling over the skyline. Cars crawled through sheets of rain below the hill where the facility stood like a wounded concrete animal. Yes, there were stabilizers. Hundreds of them. Tiny, invisible decisions buried across decades of infrastructure layering. Human judgment calls. Contextual overrides. Safeguards that existed precisely because real-world systems are messy, emotional, political, unpredictable things. The kind of complexity executives call inefficient right before disaster begins. And almost all of those stabilizers had lived inside one department. Mine. I spoke carefully. "Yes." "Are they active?" I looked back toward the building, toward the flashing emergency lights, toward the executives who had laughed this morning. Then I answered honestly, "Not anymore." Silence swallowed the line, the kind of silence that changes careers, maybe governments, maybe histories. Far above the facility, lightning tore across the clouds in white veins. For the first time all morning, I finally allowed myself a slow breath, because they were beginning to understand something terrifying. Automation had not replaced the human system. It had removed the humans holding the system together. And by the time executives realize the difference, it's usually already too late. If Grayford collapsed completely, every competitor in the sector would smell blood within hours. And Washington never forgives instability near classified contracts. Enjoying the story so far? The next chapters get darker, sharper, and far more dangerous as the silence from Washington starts revealing what Grayford was really protecting. Subscribe, follow, and stay with the story. Because the people who fired Martin Vale are about to discover that some systems don't fail loudly. They fail all at once. By 8:32 a.m., nobody inside Grayford Dynamics was pretending this was a technical glitch anymore. The atmosphere had changed completely. You could feel it in the elevators, in the hallways, in the way conversations stopped the moment someone important walked past. Fear had entered the building wearing polished shoes and carrying encrypted tablets. On level 9, Daniel Mercer stood frozen beside the conference table while legal advisors, systems analysts, and federal liaisons argued over one another in escalating waves. Every screen in the room displayed some variation of the same nightmare. Access restricted, authorization pending, external oversight active. Mercer's jaw tightened harder each time another red notification appeared. For years, he'd built his reputation on aggressive modernization. Investors loved him. Media panels loved him. He used words like adaptive disruption and future-forward integration with the confidence of a man who had never personally cleaned up a system's collapse at 3 a.m. Now the future had arrived, and it was eating the building alive. "This doesn't make sense," one attorney whispered. "Federal suspension usually requires review cycles." Elliot Harper gave a humorless laugh. "Apparently not today." Nobody appreciated the joke. A security officer entered the room abruptly. "Sir, we're getting reports that several internal archives are locking themselves." Mercer spun toward him. "What does that mean, locking themselves?" The officer hesitated. "That's the wording the engineers used." Of course it was, because nobody wants to say the terrifying version out loud. The automated containment layers were behaving independently now. Not sentient, not conscious, just blindly obedient to conflicting security logic. Which is somehow worse. People love imagining dangerous technology as evil masterminds. Reality is colder than that. Systems destroy things because they follow instructions too literally. That's why experienced infrastructure engineers become paranoid over time. We learn that disasters rarely begin with explosions. They begin with assumptions. Back in the parking lot, I finally started the engine. The heater pushed warm air slowly through the cabin while rain distorted the facility beyond the windshield into smears of gray and red light. Helen Orsini remained on the line. "We need a stabilization assessment," she said calmly. "Federal calm is different from normal calm. Normal calm tries to comfort you. Federal calm prepares for impact." "You already know the assessment," I replied. "We need confirmation." I watched employees gathering near the front entrance under the overhang, many checking phones that likely no longer connected to internal systems. Some looked confused, others angry. A few already looked defeated. Office disasters create strange tribes very quickly. The optimists, the deniers, the opportunists, the survivors. And then there are the ones who immediately begin updating resumes before the smoke is even visible. "How deep did Mercer push the rollout?" I asked. Paper shuffled faintly on her end. Autonomous substitution was expanded across 6 relay environments immediately following workforce termination. I closed my eyes briefly. 6. Jesus, that wasn't caution. That was ego operating heavy machinery. "He bypassed phased adaptation protocols," I muttered. "We know." "Then you also know why the containment systems reacted." Another pause. "Yes." Outside, thunder rolled low across the city. Somewhere beyond the clouds, aircraft lights blinked faintly through the storm like nervous stars. Orsini lowered her voice. "There's concern this could propagate." That word landed heavily. Propagate, not failure, spread. My fingers drummed once against the steering wheel. "How many connected environments?" "We're still determining that." Which meant the number was already bad. Grayford didn't merely manage contracts. The company sat inside a web of federal logistics, communications validation, procurement chains, and encrypted defense infrastructure. Most people imagine national systems as giant, centralized machines. They aren't. They're patchworks. Thousands of aging bridges, held together by undocumented human expertise and temporary fixes that somehow survived long enough to become permanent. People like me spent entire careers preventing those bridges from collapsing, and executives spent entire careers believing bridges maintain themselves. Martin, Orsini said carefully, can this be reversed? There it was, the question hidden beneath all the bureaucracy. Can we stop the bleeding before Washington decides someone must be sacrificed publicly? I looked again at the facility. Rainwater streamed down its dark glass walls. Emergency lighting pulsed behind windows like a dying heartbeat. Helicopter noise echoed faintly somewhere overhead now. Media hadn't arrived yet, but they would. Disasters attract cameras faster than ambulances. Yes, I answered finally. Elliot inhaled sharply through the other line. But not remotely. Silence. Then Mercer's voice burst into the call again. Get him back in here. Interesting? No more laughter. No more speeches about AI transformation. Now he sounded like a man trying to hold shut a door while the ocean pressed against the other side. I almost pitied him. Almost. Orsini spoke before Elliot could. Mr. Vale, if you return to the facility, federal oversight will assume operational authority during stabilization. Translation. Grayford's executives were already losing control of their own company. Faster than I expected. Mercer must have understood that too, because his tone suddenly changed. Softer now. Desperate. Martin, listen to me. We can resolve the employment situation. Employment situation. That nearly made me laugh out loud. 22 years reduced to a phrase assembled by legal consultants. I leaned back slowly in the driver's seat. The leather creaked softly beneath me. You know what the funny part is? I said. Nobody answered. I warned all of you about this 3 years ago. Memory hit me suddenly. Conference room B. Winter. Snow against reinforced windows. A 47-page risk assessment explaining exactly why fully autonomous substitution inside layered federal architecture could create recursive distrust conditions. I remembered Mercer barely glancing at the report. Too expensive, too cautious, too resistant to innovation. Executives adore the future right up until it sends them invoices. We made decisions based on available information, Mercer said stiffly. No, I replied quietly. You made decisions based on presentation slides. That one hurt. Good. Inside the facility, another alarm activated. Longer this time, sharper, the kind reserved for restricted systems compromise. Someone in the conference room cursed under their breath. Elliot finally spoke again. What do you need? Straight to logistics. Smart man. I looked toward the security gate. Vehicles were arriving now. Black federal SUVs sliding through rain with silent authority. The cavalry. Late as usual. I need full administrative rollback authority. Mercer immediately objected. Absolutely not. Of course he did, because some executives would rather drown than surrender control publicly. Orsini cut through him instantly. You're no longer in a position to negotiate terms, Mr. Mercer. That silence afterward. Beautiful, cold, clinical, final. For the first time all morning, I imagined what Mercer's face probably looked like. The realization. The terrible understanding that power inside institutions is mostly rented, never owned. And Washington had just changed landlords. I opened the car door. Rain and cold wind rushed inside immediately. Mr. Vale, Orsini asked. I stepped out slowly, staring at the massive, secure facility looming ahead through sheets of rain. Once upon a time, walking toward that building felt like purpose. Today, it felt like entering the mouth of something wounded and dangerous. But systems were failing. People inside were panicking. And despite everything, I still knew how to stop it. That was the curse of people who build critical infrastructure. Even after betrayal, part of you still wants to save everyone, especially the fools. As I started walking back toward the entrance, federal vehicles rolled past me one by one through the storm. None of them used sirens. They didn't need to. Real power rarely arrives loudly. The lobby of Grayford Dynamics looked different when I walked back in. Not physically, psychologically. A building under pressure develops its own weather. Earlier that morning, the lobby had been polished marble, muted conversations, expensive watches, and corporate confidence wrapped in climate-controlled air. Now it felt like the inside of a pressure chamber. Security personnel moved faster. Executives avoided eye contact. Assistants whispered into headsets while pretending not to panic. And somewhere beneath all of it lived the unmistakable smell of overheated electronics. Faint, metallic, nervous. The revolving doors sealed shut behind me with a heavy hydraulic click. Nobody escorted me this time. Interesting. Jensen stood near the security checkpoint, looking exhausted already. Sweat darkened the collar of his uniform, despite the cold air blasting through the lobby ventilation. When he saw me, relief flashed across his face so quickly he probably hated himself for it. "Good to see you, sir." Sir again. Crisis has a remarkable effect on corporate hierarchies. I handed him my phone temporarily for clearance verification, while federal agents crossed the lobby behind us carrying hardened cases and encrypted field equipment. One of them glanced toward me twice. Recognition. That meant Washington had already briefed them. Things were moving fast now. Too fast. "Status?" I asked Jensen quietly. He lowered his voice. "Internal systems are cycling access permissions every few minutes. Some floors are sealed. People are getting locked out of offices randomly." I nodded once. Exactly what I feared. The automation layer wasn't malfunctioning in the traditional sense. It was protecting itself. Or rather, protecting what it interpreted as trusted architecture. The problem was that trust itself had become corrupted inside the system. That's what happens when executives remove contextual oversight from adaptive infrastructure. The machine keeps obeying. It just stops understanding reality. A nearby elevator opened suddenly. 2 analysts stepped out arguing in hushed, frightened voices. Doesn't even recognize procurement credentials anymore. Washington froze external sync. Mercer says legal is handling it. Legal. That word nearly made me smile. Corporate legal departments are fascinating creatures. They operate with supreme confidence right until reality escapes contractual language. Then suddenly everyone wants engineers. Jensen handed back my phone. "You'll need temporary clearance authorization." Before I could answer, a federal agent approached. Mid-50s, dark overcoat, expression carved from granite. "Martin Vale?" "Yes." He produced credentials smoothly. "Special Oversight Division. You're authorized under emergency continuity provisions." Emergency continuity. That phrase alone told me how serious this had become. Federal agencies do not activate continuity authority because executives had a bad morning. They activate it when critical systems begin behaving unpredictably near classified infrastructure. "Where's Mercer?" I asked. "Level 9. Of course he was. Captains prefer upper decks while ships sink. The elevator ride upward felt heavier than the one earlier that morning. Back then, I'd been leaving as an obsolete employee. Now I was returning as a necessary problem. Funny how quickly institutions rediscover the value of experience once panic enters the room. The federal agent beside me watched floor numbers climb in silence. Finally, he spoke. You designed the original relay stabilization architecture? Most of it? And the autonomous replacement? I warned against it. That earned the first visible reaction from him, a slight tightening around the eyes. Professionals recognize warning signs because they've ignored enough of them in their careers. The elevator doors opened onto level 9. Chaos, not cinematic chaos, real chaos, much uglier. People speaking too quietly, too quickly, too politely. The conference room beyond the glass walls looked like a war room assembled by exhausted accountants. Screens covered every surface, displaying frozen contracts, corrupted authorization chains, and cascading containment alerts. Coffee cups everywhere, nobody drinking them. Daniel Mercer stood near the center of the room, jacket removed, sleeves rolled unevenly. He looked older now. Not physically old, structurally old. Like stress had finally exposed the true age of the man beneath the executive polish. Conversation stopped the second I entered. Every eye turned toward me. Some hopeful, some resentful, some openly afraid. Because deep down they all understood the same thing. The building trusted me more than it trusted them. Mercer forced a tight smile. Martin. No response from me. He gestured toward the screens. We need stabilization. Interesting, not please. Still clinging to authority even while drowning. I walked slowly toward the central display wall. Rows of recursive federal validation failures scrolled endlessly downward in red. There it was, exactly as predicted. The autonomous substitution layer had begun interpreting legacy manual overrides as hostile anomalies. Each correction triggered additional verification loops. Those loops triggered containment responses. Containment responses invalidated adjacent trust chains. A perfect bureaucratic nervous breakdown. Elegant, catastrophic, avoidable. One of the younger engineers spoke nervously behind me. Can you fix it? I studied the data quietly for several seconds. Then I noticed something worse, much worse. The rollback queues were empty. I turned slowly. Who disabled manual reversion? Nobody answered immediately. That silence told me everything. Finally, Mercer spoke. We streamlined rollback latency during transition. I stared at him. You removed the emergency brakes. It improved deployment efficiency. There are moments when intelligent people say things so catastrophically stupid that the room itself seems to recoil. This was one of them. Several federal officials exchanged looks. Even Elliot closed his eyes briefly, like a man developing a migraine, in real time. You embedded adaptive automation into classified infrastructure, I said carefully, and removed manual rollback capability? Mercer's jaw tightened. We were assured the predictive model was stable. Predictive model. Another phrase assembled by people who mistake probability for certainty. I stepped closer to the display. Lines of corrupted authorization logic reflected across the glass like fractures spreading through ice. Somewhere deep in the facility, another access layer failed. The lights flickered once overhead. Nobody liked that. A systems analyst swallowed hard. What happens if the propagation reaches external procurement chains? I answered without turning around. Defense logistics freeze regionally within hours. The room went completely silent. Because now the consequences had shape. Not abstract numbers, not shareholder anxiety. Real-world disruption. Contracts, supplies, clearances, movement. Modern infrastructure doesn't collapse like buildings. It collapses like circulation loss. Quietly, then everywhere, at once. Mercer stepped toward me. So stop it. There it was again. Command language. As if authority still functioned normally here. I finally turned to face him fully. Rain hammered the windows behind the city skyline, while emergency reflections pulsed red across the conference room walls. You fired the continuity division, I said softly. You mocked human oversight. You accelerated deployment before federal review. And now you're asking the same people you replaced to save the company. Mercer's face hardened. This isn't the time for personal grievances. No, I replied. This is the invoice. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke, because everyone in the room knew I was right. The dangerous thing about arrogance isn't that it makes people confident. It's that it convinces them consequences are optional. I looked back toward the screens, toward the spreading failures, toward the digital wildfire slowly crawling through systems nobody in this room fully understood anymore. Then I exhaled once. We have maybe 2 hours before containment protocols escalate nationally. A federal official near the back spoke immediately into his headset. The room erupted into motion again. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel Mercer finally looked afraid enough to understand the scale of what he had done. By 9:07 a.m., Grayford Dynamics no longer belonged to Grayford Dynamics. Not really. Federal oversight teams occupied half the conference floor. Emergency authorization documents moved between rooms under armed supervision. Entire departments had been locked out of internal systems they helped build. And through it all, the building kept humming. That was the unsettling part. Catastrophe rarely announces itself dramatically inside modern institutions. Fluorescent lights still glow. Elevators still move. Coffee machines still hiss softly in break rooms, while careers collapse 3 corridors away. Normality survives longer than dignity. I stood before the central systems wall while engineers reorganized themselves around me, with the nervous energy of passengers rearranging chairs on a sinking ship. Segment the relay chains manually, I ordered. No automated synchronization, no predictive correction layers. One analyst hesitated. But that'll slow response times. I looked directly at him. Yes. A pause, then quietly. That's the point. Around the room, keyboards erupted again, fast, controlled, human. For the first time all morning, the atmosphere shifted slightly. Not calmer exactly, but grounded, like people were finally touching concrete after drifting too long inside abstract executive fantasies. Elliot approached holding 2 printed folders. Printed. There's something deeply revealing about crises. Eventually, everyone returns to paper. Federal containment projections, he said. I flipped through them quickly. The numbers were ugly. Regional authorization paralysis, procurement instability, potential cascading freezes across adjacent contractors. Washington had already begun preparing backup continuity vendors. Grayford wasn't being rescued anymore. It was being evaluated for survivability. Mercer entered from the adjacent conference room, looking like he'd aged 10 years in 40 minutes. His tie was gone completely now. Shirt collar open, eyes bloodshot. Funny. Without the executive packaging, he suddenly resembled every exhausted middle manager I'd ever met. "What's our exposure?" he demanded. I kept reading the reports. "Depends. On what?" I finally looked at him. "How honest Washington feels like being." That landed hard. Because everyone in the room understood the translation. If federal agencies decided Grayford's negligence threatened operational stability, the company wouldn't merely lose contracts. It would become an example, and governments love examples. Mercer rubbed both hands across his face. "This can still be contained." "Naturally," I replied. Hope flashed across his expression too quickly. Then I continued, "But containment and survival aren't the same thing." Silence again. Outside, the storm intensified, rain slamming against reinforced glass in violent waves. Helicopter noise circled intermittently overhead now. Media helicopters, probably. News organizations can smell institutional blood from miles away. One of the federal technicians suddenly raised his voice. "Sir, recursive validation loops are slowing." The room froze. Every head turned toward the display wall. Red alert chains still pulsed across the monitors, but more slowly now, like a fever beginning to break. I stepped closer. Interesting, very interesting. Manual segmentation was working. Of course it was, because reality, despite what executives believe, remains stubbornly human underneath all automation. Context matters, judgment matters, experience matters. Machines process instructions. Humans understand consequences. I began issuing orders rapidly. Isolate procurement authentication. Suspend adaptive routing entirely. Restore static trust anchors manually. Force human verification across all federal relay requests. Engineers moved instantly now, not because of hierarchy, because competence creates gravity during emergencies. People instinctively orbit whoever understands the fire. Mercer stood off to the side, watching the room operate without him. That might have been the cruelest moment of all. Not the collapse, the irrelevance. For years, he'd believed leadership meant momentum, disruption, vision. But now, in the middle of a real systems crisis, none of his presentation language mattered. The room wasn't surviving on vision. It was surviving on institutional memory, on cautious engineers, on undocumented knowledge, on the boring, invisible people executives stopped seeing after enough promotions. Elliot stepped beside me quietly. "You knew this would happen." Not a question. I kept my eyes on the monitors. "I knew it could." "You should have fought harder." That one surprised me. I turned toward him slowly. "For what?" I asked. "To protect people who treated safeguards like inefficiency?" He didn't answer. Because there wasn't an answer. That's the tragedy of institutional arrogance. The people warning about disaster are usually dismissed specifically because they understand disaster too well. A junior engineer suddenly spoke from across the room. "External authorization channels are responding again." Another voice followed immediately. "Pentagon relays stabilizing." Then another. "Containment escalation halted." The room exhaled collectively. Not celebration, exhaustion, like survivors surfacing after being held underwater too long. Even the lighting somehow felt warmer now. Mercer moved toward me carefully. "So we stopped it." I studied him for a long second. Rainwater streaked the windows behind him in silver lines. Red emergency reflections still pulsed faintly across the glass walls. Somewhere downstairs, phones rang endlessly through the building like distant alarms nobody remembered to silence. Then I answered. No. Confusion crossed his face. I nodded toward the federal teams. We prevented national propagation. His shoulders loosened slightly in relief. Then I finished. Grayford's still finished. The words settled into the room heavily. Because everyone already knew it was true. Washington would never fully trust the company again after this morning. Oversight investigations alone would devour careers for years. Investors would panic. Competitors would move in like sharks smelling blood in dark water. And somewhere inside, thousands of internal emails, meeting recordings, and ignored risk reports lived a perfect trail leading directly to executive decisions. Mercer looked suddenly smaller somehow. What happens now? I glanced around the conference room one final time, at the exhausted engineers, at the federal agents, at the executives who had spent years treating human expertise like an expensive inconvenience. Then I looked back at the storm outside. The rain was finally beginning to weaken. Now, I said quietly. I picked up my coat from the back of a chair. Now you learn the difference between automation and responsibility. Nobody stopped me when I walked toward the exit. Not Mercer, not federal oversight, not security. The building itself almost seemed quieter, as if the crisis had stripped away the illusion it had worn for years. In the elevator down to the lobby, I caught my reflection again in the mirrored wall. Same suit, same face, same tired eyes. But something had changed. Not revenge, not victory, just clarity. 22 years inside Grayford had taught me one unavoidable truth. The most dangerous systems in the world are not powered by machines. They're powered by people convinced they no longer need other people. The lobby doors opened. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the scent of rain and wet concrete. Outside, the federal vehicles remained parked beneath gray skies, while journalists gathered beyond the perimeter barriers like birds waiting for movement. I stepped past them all without speaking. Behind me, high above the secure facility, emergency lights still flashed faintly through the storm clouds. Not as warnings anymore, as evidence. And somewhere deep inside the building, Daniel Mercer finally understood the thing he should have learned long before this morning. Some human knowledge doesn't look valuable until the exact second it disappears.